Today I'm speaking to Sarah Thurstan. Sarah is a director of Performance Link, which is a company that specialises in developing a speaker's personal presence and enabling them to feel comfortable in their own skin. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, Robert.
Hi. I thoroughly recommend Sarah's book, Personal Presence, for anyone wanting to improve their speaking and presentation. Now, before we learn about some of the key issues around presenting and communicating to others, I wonder if you could tell me a little of your story. How did you come to be doing the work you do now?
Well, thank you for asking, Robert. How did I come to be where I am now? So first of all, I trained as an actor in my 20s. But prior to that, I'd been a teacher of English as a foreign language for the British Council in Scandinavia. And throughout my life, I've taught at various times tertiary education as well as TEFL. And then with being an actor in the 90s, I joined a cooperative acting agency. And there we started to do what we call transferable skills. In other words, taking theatre and TV skills into the academic and corporate world. And we started at the BBC, as it happened, doing interview technique training with all the designers who sadly were going to be made redundant because this was the time of John Burt. And they had to interview for every project that they went on. And some of them who'd won BAFTA awards actually had never done an interview. So we started as producers, if you like, interviewing them. And then we went on to work in the academic world and so on. And actually, as it happened, I seemed to be quite good at this. And I took on the name Performance Link Limited, which I bought off the actors in 1990 and set up my own company. So in a sense, what I do is a combination of teaching and the skills that I bring from the TV and theatre world. So that's me. That's really how I got here.
Thank you, Sarah. I think it's great to hear how you got to where you are today, because that's your story. And in your book, Personal Presence, you're very much highlighting the importance of storytelling. Why are stories so important to good presentations?
Yes, they are very important to good presentations, Robert. Firstly, I must mention that for me, authenticity is the key in terms of presentation or public speaking. We have seen over the years too many insincere people, sadly sometimes amongst our politicians. And insincerity, immediately, it means that you lose trust. So when you tell your personal story, it leads much more to authenticity and therefore trust. And if you imagine that the more you share with your people, your audience, your clients, your team, the more open you are, the more you disclose, that actually means there's more there for them to get hold of and to make links with and connections. So storytelling, A, helps authenticity, but B, builds that absolute important connection and makes engagement with people, because it shows that you're human. This is what you've done, you know. And even more for leaders, I do encourage leaders in, you know, whichever area of work, to actually talk a little bit about maybe some of the learning and the mistakes that they've made. Because if you disclose that you've made a mistake, then how do you think your people feel? They'll feel, oh, well, he's human or she's human, isn't she? Because she's had to learn on the way up, just like me. So now I can admit that I broke the photocopier yesterday or whatever it is, you know. So it's really important to show that human side of yourself, which, you know, builds rapport, really. And that's a kind of, it's more a modern way of public speaking and presentation. And I'm sure that you'll know, Robert, that in the past that leaders or CEOs never admitted that they made mistakes, did they? Because they thought, oh, everybody, oh, see my weaknesses. Oh, we can't allow that. But for me, in this day and age, that is really important, that you do share, you know, what I call vulnerabilities, which can be a strength. And that's storytelling, really.
Thank you. I guess the best stories are very personal and human ones that come from our own experience. And it can take some courage to share the deeply personal stories that we have.
Yes. Yes, it can. Yes, Robert. And I have had an experience of working with very senior people that when they told a deeply personal story, and I'll give you an example. I was in the States actually working for a large company, and I had the very senior team with me in my group. And I asked them all to tell a small personal story. It's almost like an icebreaker, really, but just to get used to speaking out. But I always use that word personal. It's not about the business. It's not you know, not what percentages you built. It's your personal story. And this lady, I shall never forget, she told a story about a friend of hers who had actually been killed in a motorbike accident because he had been drinking alcohol. He was obviously drunk. And her actual objective was to talk about how drinking and driving was a terrible thing. But actually what it did was, because she talked about her friend, it brought up all the emotions of what she felt when the friend died. And actually she then broke down. Now, I'm not saying that people should break down, but what was interesting about that is that it brought out some emotions that she didn't actually realize were there until she voiced it. She'd sort of hidden it, or it was in denial. And actually, even though she was very emotional and had tears, it was very powerful because we really understood where she was coming from. And if anybody has taught me not to drink and drive, it was that little experience I had with that lady. So any personal story, and it doesn't have to be tragic, and people always think it has to be funny, but it doesn't have to be funny either. It can be something you overheard on the bus, you know, but it meant something to you. Alan Bennett, the wonderful playwright, always used to listen to people on buses, which is why his scripts are so human and hilarious. And because he just used to have a little notebook and jot down and listening to these wonderful remarks, and also from all his aunties that he used to listen to all the time. So it might be that, or it might be that you were on the tube this morning and somebody behaved in rather an odd way, you know, anything. But in every story that you tell, we as the listener make a connection, make what I call a silent connection. And the more you disclose, like the lady I told you in America, the more you disclose, the more you open yourself, if you like, to being seen. And that's how you build trust. And I use in my programs, and it's in the book that you showed us, Robert, something called the Johari window, which is how the more you open yourself and you self-disclose, the more you build empathy and rapport with your people and your audience. And obviously the more personal, the better. But you have to be confident sometimes to do that. You know, to say, right, today I'm going to tell them. I heard one presentation where somebody started, our company, who's the CEO, our company lost £4 billion last year. That was his opening line, you know, and everybody was agog completely, because not only disclosed, but then he was going to say what he'd done and what was necessary to do to ameliorate the situation. So, but it needed confidence, didn't it? You know, not many people would admit that their company lost that much money. Yeah. So self-disclosure, Robert, and the other thing is self-awareness. And you can't be a good communicator unless you are self-aware. And self-awareness comes in two forms. Firstly, the form that you know who you are. So the confidence, for example, okay, I'm tall and fairly ancient, and I've got a very loud received pronunciation voice, etc. So I'm aware of that. I'm also aware that I can be a bit scary sometimes when I stand up because I'm very tall. But there's this other side of the impact that you have on other people. What effect do you have? And one of the issues with, again, some of our politicians or people in high status positions is that they have had an elitist background for one reason or another, maybe private education, and they don't actually know who the general public are or the ordinary people are because they live in an elitist bubble. And that's really important. You have to know the effect that you have, and that's part of the self-awareness bundle. So it's two, one about you and one about the effect.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And for some people, taking part in meetings can present a real challenge, can't it? Especially having a voice and speaking out.
Yeah, good point. Good point, Robert. So I've often attended meetings and people struggle. Often women, especially in hierarchical situations, and if they're young, what do often the men imagine? That they're there to take the notes or make the tea, you know. And I'm not being facetious, that still happens. And I've seen it happen. And often, yes, with young men as well, you know, who don't feel that confident. They just get talked over by what we call the senior male grey hairs. I mean, if you look at the FTSE 100 index, you know, the leaders, if you look at all the leaders in those FTSE 100s, I think there is 2 women and 1 person of colour, you know. So daunting, isn't it? We have a long way to go. But this is what happens in meetings, especially in what I call hierarchical companies. Most of my clients, I must say, like to be non-hierarchical. In other words, people take responsibility for themselves. They have their own accountability. So if you're a consultant in a company, you don't expect somebody else to do your photocopying for you or bring you tea or do your agenda or your typing. You do it yourself, you know, because the office, which, you know, works for the consultancy, is not there at your bidding. Anyhow, but I've seen in meetings, I've seen actual, sometimes men doing this. Just that. And what does that say? That says, no, stop talking. I'm more important than you, actually. So just be quiet. And that's really, you know, that's so daunting. And then, of course, they're quiet because they lose their confidence. And their self-worth goes down. So my premises is that if you're running that meeting, if you're the chair, it's your responsibility not to have any of that kind of behavior in the meeting, and to, you know, to pick up on it. If somebody's speaking, you don't do that. You know, you invite them, you watch and you listen. You also make eye contact with everybody in the room. I've seen, you know, the person who's supposed to be the decision maker, he is the only person who gets the eyes. And sometimes it's a she. But all the other people don't get any of the eye contact. And how does that make them feel? That makes them feel like they're not important. They, you know, they needn't be there. So they may as well just go on their phone and do their messages. Those body language things are really important in meetings. So what I suggest to my clients is that before they go into what they might deem a bit scary or a daunting meeting, they write down 1 or at most 3 things, rule of 3, that they want to say. So they've written it down. They practice over and over again out loud to the trees, to the animals, to the child, to the dog, whatever, until they can say it backwards and forwards and inside out. And then when they're in that meeting, they introduce that idea at a good point, but it will come out fluently. The issue is we all think it's all up here in our heads, which it is, but unless we're completely versed with it, it might not come out if we lose our confidence. So that's what I suggest with people who are really struggling with, shall we say, hierarchical senior partners or whatever in a meeting, or bullies even, or over assertive people. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Sarah. So, yeah, so you've already given us some very useful tactics and strategies just within this conversation already. But I just wonder if there was one thing that you would recommend that somebody worked on to improve their public speaking or their presentation more effectively, what would it be?
Well, actually, I'm going to give you two things. I hope you don't mind. Firstly, always think who your audience is. What do they need? What do they want? Because it's about them more than about you. So be aware of their needs and who they are. You know, if you've got a group of school leavers, it's a very different audience to, shall we say, the Women's Institute at the Village Hall. Yeah. So think about that, A, and B, prepare. Now, that's not just the words you're going to say, but prepare your body and your voice and your mind. And by that, I mean breathing, at least 3 deep breaths, which you make your rib cage expand out and in, out and in. For those people who play a woodwind instrument, they'll know this anyhow, but you've got to get your lungs going. And that deep breathing actually helps to moderate the palpitations in your heart, which you might get if you're feeling very adrenalized or nervous. And also, yes, so breathing helps with the deportment, so you sit up, so all that, and maybe some humming and doing some tongue twisters so that your diction is good. So that physical and mental preparation is really important, as well as thinking about your audience.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. And so much has had to change in the way we communicate while COVID rages. What are the things we need to pay attention to in the future?
Good question. Well, first of all, as we are doing now, so much of our communication is going to be done online, virtually, whether it's Zoom or Microsoft Teams. So we need to get good at that. You know, we need to actually practice with it and practice so that we can bring our persona over through the screen. You need to speak more slowly because of the time lapse. You need to look to make eye contact with your camera. You need to keep your laptop lifted, etc. So think about those technical things. As I said earlier, I've been an actor for many years, and I was on a webinar with a casting director, and he said, "I'm just telling you now, you guys, you just got to get used to self-tapes." And that meant that we've got to get used to filming ourselves. You know, we've got to be good at it, because that's the way forward. I mean, I'm hoping we can come back to face, you know, in 6 months or so, but I still think there's going to be a lot of this technical work, you know, virtual work. That, and I also think from an empathy point of view, especially for leaders, for your friends, your colleagues, you've got to think about mental health. I've already seen so many people whose mental health has gone rock bottom because of COVID, because they've lost their jobs, or because they've been indoors for months and months and months, or in young people particularly, because they, their future looks so bleak with the economy and their work, and therefore they lose self-confidence and they have lack of self-worth and self-esteem. So I think we, the older generation, have got to be mindful that we need to support those young people in any way that we can to make their mental health better. Yeah, so that's what I think post-COVID we need to think about.
Certainly, and certainly I'm noticing, changes in the way mental health problems are arising now as a result of COVID, not necessarily directly related to COVID, but being emphasized, things being worse because of COVID. So a lot of attention needs to be paid to that. Thank you, Sarah.
Yes, yes, sorry, Robert, you must You must see it a lot as a therapist. You must have experienced that recently.
I do indeed, yes. And I think people almost feel embarrassed to be saying that they're experiencing mental health because of COVID, because we're all in the same boat, and it feels a little bit, like you might be weak because you feel that you're suffering and others don't appear to be. So I think I do think we have a lot to deal with in that respect.
Yes.
Well, Sarah, it's been really great to speak to you. Thank you very much for sharing your experience and talking to us today. I'll just remind people again of the book, Personal Presence, and I'll put a link on my website alongside this recording today. Thank you very much. Very much.
Thank you, Robert.
Bye-bye.